This is Donna Van Scoder, interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. May 10th, is it? 1972, in Bartlesville, in the Presbyterian Church. We're interviewing Mr. Bern T. Buff. Mr. Bern F. Buff. Why don't you tell us about your early background and how you came to come to Oklahoma?
All right. I was born in a rough sawed slab, one-room house in Crawford County, Illinois. My father operated a sawmill at the time, and later on, we were living on a farm about 3/4 of a mile from a small incorporated town called Eaton, E-A-T-O-N. This was a fortunate place for me to be, considering the way the opportunities came to me, because it was in Crawford County, Illinois, that oil was first discovered in Illinois. And this was an intensely interesting thing to a young boy. And after I got to Oklahoma, the things that I learned just by accident there turned out to be very useful to me. Well, then another fortunate thing was that I started school when I was only 5. I had to walk a mile across the fields to the school. But the fortunate thing was that it was a little one-room schoolhouse. Now, the fortunate thing about that is that I got to hear students in all grades. And if I didn't have enough in my own grade to keep me busy, there was always something interesting to listen to. And the final result of that was that I was only 10 years old when I finished grade school. And then my father's father and his brothers, several of his brothers, had been involved in starting a small college just 15 miles from where we were living at Eaton, across the Wabash River, a little town called Miram. And this was a Christian church, Disciples of Christ Church, designed to turn out preachers. This shows how far you can miss your mark sometimes. But I stayed with that school all the way through, although it became very difficult in the last couple of years when I had to work 12 hours a day and try to get some time in at school too. But I ended, and in that last 2 years, a very fortunate thing was that a young man came there who was educated as a chemist, graduate of Wabash College, and he established a chemistry department in this little UC college. And I just fell head over heels in love with this subject. It was just so interesting. More than that, when I had finished school, he immediately started offering me one job after another. First year.
When did you finish?
When?
Mm-hmm.
It would be 1915. And he offered me a job that year to come with him to another Indiana town, Greenfield, Indiana, to teach chemistry. But on account of my mother's health, which was very poor, I didn't want to leave. So I remained and taught school in this little town of Merrim. I taught the 5th and 6th grade 1 year. And before the next school term opened, my mother had died, and then I felt free to go. And I did go back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with him, where I first worked on a synthetic phenol. Now, that's carbolic acid in common terms, but this was approaching, you see, World War I, and we got all that sort of chemicals from Germany. And so this Mellon Institute had a project to develop a method for manufacturing. And I wasn't a fellow of the Institute, but when they got ready to try their factory out, I was employed there and stayed there for several months.
As a chemist?
As a chemist. Well, I did quite a little work out in the plant, too. And gathered up a little knowledge that way. And then I was very quick-tempered in those days, and I got into fuss with foreman, and next place that I went was in St. Louis, Missouri, at a steel mill.
That's quite a change, isn't it?
That's quite a change. And it really was more than a usual change, because they were so well organized in their chemical laboratory.
At the steel mill or at Pittsburgh?
No, this was at St. Louis.
Okay.
And I really learned how to turn work out of the laboratory right there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I only stayed with them a few months, and there was a plant being started and to manufacture phenol. So having a little something offered there, I got a better job, and was with them when I received another telegram from my good friend and chemistry teacher, Tom Harney, and he wanted me to come back to Pittsburgh, or near Pittsburgh, at a zinc smelter, American Zinc and Chemical Company. So I went. I started in the laboratory, but they didn't leave me there more than a couple of months until they had me out in the plant. And it was an ideal existence for a year or so.
What do you mean by out in the plant? What did you do?
Well, out in the plant, they made me, I had a fancy title. I was assistant superintendent of the furnace department, but it was my job, really, to oversee the unloading of materials like zinc concentrates, and to prepare this material by grinding and screening and deliver it to the roasting department. And then I had to deliver it back after it had been roasted. I'd deliver it back to the roasted ore bins, and I had to deliver it from there to the place where it was mixed with coal to be charged to the furnaces.
And you were in charge of making sure it went to all those places.
That's right. And I eat this up too. It was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And we had an ideal living situation. 8 of us. They furnished a house for 8 of us.
8 in your family?
No.
You mean 8 in your family, or
No, I
8
didn't
men
have any
working
family
there?
at that time.
Oh,
It was at this point that I did meet Elsie Bowman, who was a West Virginia girl, happened to be visiting up there. And so before I let her get back to West Virginia, I had her word that we'd get married that fall. And so we did, on December the 15th.
And what year was that?
Ma'am?
What year was that?
That would be 1916.
Okay.
And we've got our 1917 it was. No, it's 16 when we were married. So we've got our 55th anniversary coming up at the end of the year. Then the general manager of this company was a Bartlesville man from a Bartlesville family. His name was Jones, Archibald Jones, and he had operated one of these zinc plants here, and then had gone back to Pennsylvania. He was loved by all of his subordinates, and he got fired. And I probably don't know all of the background of that, except that every one of his staff members resigned and quit in protest, excepting only one. Well, I was among those who quit, but World War I you were being registered for World War I had an idea I'd like to be a flyer. And I really, after taking the examination, thought I had it made. But when I went up and to present what they called your written credentials, like your sheepskin and so on, it really didn't amount to much. I was the first one there, and the major who was conducting the examination took a look at my papers, and he said, "Why, you didn't pass the physical." You can imagine what a shock this was to me. And but I had a few shekels put together that time, and I wanted to get married to Elsie Bowman, and we went right ahead with it. We're married in Pittsburgh on the 15th of December, and we spent those shekels I had in visiting all the way out to Wichita.
Wichita, Kansas? Or
Well, we were
what was it?
we were just taking a wedding trip, and at Wichita, I had word through an employment agency that I would go to Toledo, Ohio, and work for the Willys Overland Company, who were building Sunbeam motors for Canadian aircraft. And I did go there, and we stayed about 6 months, and then I had another telegram from Harney, and he wanted me to come to Little Rock, Arkansas, which we did, about the middle of Arkansas, about the middle of the year. And I stayed there until the war ended, which was not too long. But our little girl was born while we were there in Arkansas in November. And then, well, she was born 7 days after the armistice. And so then, by some stroke of good fortune, the company subcontractor on a job of 3,000 men selected 3 people that were going to open an office in New York. One of those 3 people was me. And then when my education really began, because...
How old were you at this time?
Well, I was 21. And this brings us up to 1919, January the 1st, 1919, when I went to New York. And so I did have a wife and a little baby at that time. So I went ahead and looked for a place for us to stay. But the main point of this job is that they were a good engineering concern, and all kinds of mechanical, structural, and engineers. And I'd been in business a long time, knew all about the business, except for one thing. They didn't have anybody with chemical knowledge, excepting me. This gave me a little edge, and
I bet it gave you a lot of work to do, too.
It gave me work, but very interesting. We were only about 2 blocks from the New York public library. And whenever an inquiry came in and was examined by the department heads in the company, and they had no knowledge about it, they turned it over to me.
What type of inquiry do you mean?
Well, somebody wanted to build a plant to produce, well, let's say, methylene blue as a color that is quite frequently used in dyeing materials. It's the dye stuff.
Okay.
And there were dozens of these things which had been bought for the Germans, from the Germans, and we were trying to do it ourselves now.
Oh, I see.
So they'd give me this inquiry, and I'd study about it a little bit, and maybe even work out a scheme in my mind how to do it. And then I'd hightail over to the library and find out that about 50 years ago, somebody had already tried the same idea I had, and it hadn't worked. So, but I was around the New York area until 1921, and we were sent back to Little Rock then, and an attempt was made to operate that government explosives plant as a commercial enterprise, chemical plant. But after another year or two, it didn't work. But in that year or so, again in Little Rock, we had a son born. So both of our children were born in Little Rock, Arkansas.
What are the names of your children?
Our daughter is Mrs. Virginia Myers of Tulsa. She's divorced. And about 2.5 weeks ago, the Allied Arts and Humanities Council at Bartlesville did her the signal honor to present her with an award as an outstanding member coming from this community. She's a musician, a graduate of the Eastman School of Music, and she's very interested in electronic music, and in fact owns the only, mind you, the only electronic synthesizer in the state of Oklahoma.
Does she really?
Yes, she gives lectures at OU and OSU and other points. So, and she's also music director of the Allied Living Arts Council, they call them in Tulsa. Very capable woman. And her greatest success was she had 2 wonderful grandchildren. And her daughter, who was 28 in March, has hung out her shingle as a psychiatrist now in San Diego.
Wow.
She's married to a man who decided to take on a little more medical education and become a neurologist instead of an internist. That'll make him 14 years of schooling before he hangs his shingle out.
14 more?
14 altogether from the time he started pre-med course. And he's a fine young man. Our grandson is another 1.5 years, he'll be a lawyer. He's already graduated the University of Chicago on a 4-year all-paid scholarship. And he taught a year of school in Chicago also. But he's in San Diego too. So.
What about your son?
He's
What's
dead.
his name?
He died in New Orleans about 4 years ago of a heart attack, 46 years old.
And his name?
His name was James. Well,
Maybe we were in Little Rock about 1921 when we got off with your kids.
That'll be right. So, after we'd been in New York and returned to Little Rock, then Harney again wanted me to come and help him. He had invented a new type of sulfuric acid plant, and he wanted me to come to Nitro, West Virginia, and help him demonstrate it. And this I did. I spent about a month there, got the thing to run just like it's supposed to for about 6 hours. He brought a party of 11 people in there to see it run, and I made a run for him for 6 hours anyway. But he didn't get any business, so I had to start looking for a job in 1921. Finally, got a very menial type of job at 55 cents an hour working for the Dupont company making celluloid.
Where was
Later,
this?
yeah,
Where was this?
that was at Newark, New Jersey.
Okay.
Then later on, I got a job with Rosselli Chemical Company, and we bought a little house and moved in there and so forth. And then my father put out a distress call from Wichita. He was manufacturing an oil burner that he had invented, and he just couldn't get the production out fast enough to take care of as many as he was selling. Well, I went there to help him and got that straightened out. But then his business fell off, and I was out of a job. So I came to Bartlesville with a wife, 5-year-old daughter, and a 3-year-old son.
22 or 23?
1923, on February the 15th in 1923. And this was another thing that I found entrancing, the things that were done. Nothing like it anywhere. And I had to know all about it.
What things do you mean?
Oh, for example, this is a very 150-year-old process, but there were so many ways in which it was primitive, and I could just walking through and looking, I could see so many opportunities to improve it. And in time, I had an opportunity to do that. And fortunately, most of my attempts were successful. Well, and then a little about the company that I went to work for. There were 3 smelters built in Bartlesville in 1907, the year of statehood. And of those 3, one was National Sink. And the reason that they came to Bartlesville was because they were heavy consumers of natural gas. And here was Osage County with plenty of natural gas being developed. Now, Bartlesville was known as an oil town, but they didn't produce very much oil and never had a refinery or anything like that. Great offices here, great company, Phillips Petroleum Company. And at that time, there was the city service coming into Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company. There's a jawbreaker.
Yeah, that's a long one.
And so these 3 plants started, and this was right at the time of World War, just before World War I. And you couldn't keep from making money if you could just make a little zinc. And so it was very successful, and went on until, I guess, the employees, there were one time 1,200 men working in the 3 smelters here. And then the war ended, the bubble burst, but the men working there couldn't believe it. They thought the company was just trying to beat the wages down something, so they had a strike for about a year and a half. And they were had been going a few months when I came down in 1923. And as I say, it was ripe for improvements of all kinds. And this was my dish. I just ate it. So in 1927, the company decided to close a plant they had leased at Argentine, that's Kansas City, Kansas. Their lease expired in 1927, so I got them to put in an entirely different roasting setup to convert zinc sulfide into zinc oxide, which can be mixed with coal and then put in a hot retort and heated until the zinc will boil off. And it can be condensed and you've got something you can sell. But at Argentine, they had a chemical plant. Really the basis for which was a sulfuric acid plant. They belatedly decided to cancel that lease and to build a sulfuric acid plant at Bartlesville. And this was made possible by the fact that I had talked them into building what's known as multiple hearth roasters, 12 hearths high, 12 floors high, but the floors were only a couple of feet, so they're only about 35 feet above the legs they stood on. And this produced a much stronger gas. Prior to that, the roasting had been done in such a way that in a long, flat, poorly ventilated hood, and the gases just blew around and killed the vegetation. But
so good.
so by this multiple hearth roasting system, which was not new, it just hadn't been used in the right place.
How'd you find out about it?
Well, you run on those things when you're reading about
In the journals
metallurgy
of
and chemistry and some of those things. You find out what's available and what's been tried. And then the man who headed up the company was a German-born man. His name was Benno, B-E-N-N-O, Elkan, E-L-K-A-N. Fine man that better man than never lived. But he had a sales office in New York, metal sales. This would be copper, zinc, lead, tin, gold, silver, whatever you want to buy. And he had the ability to make very useful friends, and one of them was Frederick H. Laist, L-A-I-S-T, who at the time I'm referring to was general manager of the Anaconda Copper Company at Butte, Montana. But when Mr. Elkan wanted to have the final say on any metallurgical problem, he didn't have that much faith in a kid like me. He went to Mr. Laist, and in fact, before we built this kind of roaster, Mr. Laist said, if you want me to try that for you on zinc, you send me about 10 carloads. I've got a couple of roasters out there not doing anything. I'll put them through there and send them back to you. All you got to do is just pay for the operating expense. Well, this was a good deal. And this is the way you get information, and in this particular case. Well, we struggled along with this acid plant for a number of years. Strange how things change around. One of the main reasons we wanted to come to Bartlesville is that nearly all of the sulfuric acid we produced up at Argentine, Kansas, went to oil refineries like up at Coffeyville, Kansas, and it was down in this section that the acid moved from Argentine. So this was one of the reasons that we built an acid plant here. And
what was your position with the company by this time?
well, I was called Superintendent of Smelting. By and large, there's two processes involved in the operations out here. One of them is to smelt the zinc, to smelt the concentrates and make zinc. And then the other one is the roasting and making of acid. So they brought down W.H. Leverett, who had been started with the company in 1916 and managed the plant. He was manager of the plant when they decided to build here. And incidentally, he's just died within the last 6 months.
How do you spell his name?
Leverett. His son, Miles, Miles, was a direct descendant of Miles Standish. Married a Bartlesville girl. But they had decided to change the process to abandon the old time chamber process and adopted a brand new process called the contact process. And in fact, when the Bartlesville plant was constructed and put into operation, it was among the first in the United States to use another kind of contact mask. Now, I know that sounds crazy to you, but there are certain substances and vanadium to use another kind of contact mask. Now, I know that sounds crazy to you, but there are certain substances, and vanadium pentoxide is one of them, which can be held in little pellets and then at a certain limited temperature range, like 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and pass sulfur dioxide gas through this material, and by means that our smartest chemists can't explain today, that sulfur dioxide, along with some oxygen that it carried with it, instead of becoming SO2, becomes SO3. It just hooks up to another atom of oxygen. Well, if you take SO3 and add H2O, that's water, then you have sulfuric acid. But the surprising thing is that the vanadium pentoxide remains unchanged. And it has this remarkable thing. Well, we changed it a little bit when it got down here because we poisoned it. Yes, we, nobody knew or thought about the possibility that the zinc concentrates mined over around Miami, Joplin, so forth, would have anything deleterious in it to hurt vanadium pentoxide. Previously, platinum had been used, very expensive. And, but it did. It acted on the vanadium pentoxide, and after a few short weeks of run, we got no catalytic action. On investigation, we found out that the vanadium pentoxide had broken down. Well, we got it from Monsanto Chemical Company. They had just brought it out. They didn't know too much about it, but they quick got on the job, and eventually it was made to work, and it's still used now, right now. And well, this is one of the giant steps forward. And in that connection, another development had occurred in Australia, in which a machine used in the lead industry would really a series of little cast iron wagons were pushed over a track by huge sprocket wheels as high as this room, two of them, and all very heavily constructed, pushed over a box, and to the box there was a suction pipe that drew air down through this bed material. Now, if you got this mixture of fine material properly mixed and add moisture to it and so forth, and spread it on this traveling little wagon that was pushed along. The wagon had little grates down at the bottom, and that let air go down through those grates and into the wind box underneath. And lo and behold, this stuff would stick together just like clinker in a stove. And it had a trade name called Sinter, S-I-N-T-E-R. And we were the first in these United States to try that thing right here in Bartlesville. And
whose idea was to try it here?
Ma'am?
Whose idea was it to try it here?
Well, it really was not mine. It was, I hadn't been here that long yet, but I'll tell you, I really didn't miss a thing that happened there at that machine. And of course there was trouble. Didn't run off. Just like love, of course, it never runs smoothly all the time. But this turned out to be to my advantage too, because Mr. Lloyd, this was called a Dwight Lloyd sintering machine. He was one of the inventors. He was really the inventor. Yeah. Dwight put up the money, but Mr. Lloyd put up the brains on it. Right. And he came out here and spent a week, and he made that thing work.
And he had something to go on.
Oh, I tell you,
what year was this?
This was in 1925, and he was a great one. And I didn't let a minute go by that I could be with that man. I was out here till 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night to watch him, see what he did, and listen to what he said. So this became a plant that was a magnet to metallurgists interested in zinc all over the world. We had them coming in here from all around the world to see this sintering machine operate. And so this was a part of the roasting project that included the multiple hearth roasters, and then we were producing sinter. And with it, just to give a motivation to it, we were able to roast this material on the sintering machine at a lower cost than has been done by anybody else. But not only that, they had developed in the mining industry a method for getting higher recovery of zinc out of the dirt taken out of the ground, but it entailed very fine crushing, and just flour-like when after it's crushed. But some researcher had discovered that if you would take this very finely ground material and float it in water, blow bubbles up through it to float it in water, and then add certain types of oil to it, that it would produce a froth. Yeah, just like soap bubbles.
Wow.
And the particular kind of oil that you used would attract either lead or zinc or iron. Bring them up, they would skim these bubbles off and wash them on a filter, and there you had your zinc concentrates. But it was a kind of waste product at the time we brought the sintering machine along, and you could buy it for $1 a ton less. And we capitalized on that for 3-4 years before the other boys all caught up. And then everybody had sintering machines.
Yeah.
And that advantage was lost. But the next big step was to further improve our roasting and our acid plant. And in 1954, we put in a fluid bed roaster. Now this sounds unbelievable at first, but you could take this same very fine material and mix it with water and make a thick enough slurry, if slurry is the proper name, that you could pump it. And it was pumped into a 20-foot diameter brick-lined tank about 16 feet high, and it was arranged so that you could blow air up through that. Well, you started off by heating that chamber up with natural gas until this will start to burn. Talk about the fluid bed roaster, and when you blow this gas up through the fine material, which went in there wet, you understand, and of course it's almost explosive when you put wet material into a chamber that at a temperature of 16 or 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, it just blows up, except it's continuous if you just keep doing it. It just becomes like a generation of gas, and that's what took place. Where formerly the strongest gas we were able to supply to the acid plant was about 5 to 6%. This fluid bed roaster would supply gas even as strong as 11% of SO2. So that's quite a change. And it brought some problems along too, but we worked those out eventually. It takes time. I say the 3 Ps: pertinacity, persistence, and patience. You have to have the 3 Ps in order to get these things done.
That's your motto?
Ma'am?
Is that your motto?
Well, that's one of them.
Okay.
But that brings us up, though, to these things we put in 1954 are still operating at National Zinc Company. And then ecology set in, and so they decided just about time I left the company, at their request. They told me I'd 70 years ago fell out of a place like that. I wouldn't have quit. I just kept on. But anyway, they built for $3 million a brand new sulfuric acid contact plant that was the best that could be built then, and I think are now. But still, they're not sure whether it will meet the standards being established by these wild-eyed, ivory-towered ecologists. So this hangs in the balance. And
you think they may not be able to use it at all?
Well, if they, some people, like you have a representative from Oklahoma City, is that your home?
No.
Well, that's one thing in your favor. They have a man who says he's an engineer by the name of Bamberger, and he had a half a dozen bills before the last legislature that would shut this place down. Well, fortunately, they were not passed. But now, there's danger there. There's great danger. And this man is, I classify him, I have a special word for them. I call them pseudo engineers. They're imitation engineers. They've read enough of the words, but they don't know what they mean. That's the trouble with this man. He's a sincere citizen. He wants to do the right thing and all that kind of business. And he's read all these big words and read the definition for him, but he doesn't understand. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know the harm that can result from shutting down an operation where there's 500 or 600 families depending on that operation.
Then you think the economics of the situation are more important than any damage that the plant might be doing?
I think that it has to be considered, known and considered. And I confronted this gentleman. Oh, this brings up another part of my experience here. Early on, the company became supporters of two state organizations. One of them, the Oklahoma Public Expenditures Council, and you've read some about that lately in connection with Freeway 77. They brought out the facts. They deal in facts. And the other one is a definitely pointed lobbying concern, the Associated Industries of Oklahoma. And it is an association of about 700 or 800 manufacturers and builders and so on. And they definitely go to the state legislature every year and do everything they can to influence the legislature to vote favorably to industry. And I had the honor, I guess it was 1959 and 60, I was president of this organization. And again, they had to scrape the bottom of the barrel here about 3-4 years ago, and I took another 2-year shot at it. And
you're too modest, I'm sure.
Well, it's been another one of those rewarding things to me. But this is one of the problems I confronted at a meeting we had at the Hilton Inn Hotel in Oklahoma City about, I guess the end of December, toward the end of December, November, December, around in there. This fellow Bamberger was one of those invited over there. He got up and he talked to him about 15 minutes. He said, done a lot of talking about ecology and pollution. And he said there's been some debate about the facts, but he says now the facts are in. Now we need the enforcement. So when he got down, he asked if there were any questions, and I had my hand up right now. So I got up and I said, Mr. Bamberger, I would like respectfully to disagree with the very first statement you made, which was a very important one. You said that all the facts are in. Now I said, you must be aware of the fact that within the last 3 weeks, the Surgeon General of the United States Public Health Service has said for publication that he thinks the substitutes for phosphates in detergents are doing more harm than the phosphates did. And his advice to the average housewife is to go ahead and use her detergents. He said, yes, I know about that, but he didn't have any rebuttal. Then I said one further thing. You mentioned during your discussion terrible situation in Lake Erie, which is a dying lake. And there's no doubt about that, because all lakes die if you give them enough time to fill in with silt and so forth. The surprising thing, though, is that Dr. Pecora, who is head of the United States Geological Survey, reports in August 1970 that the annual catch of marketable fish in Lake Erie exceeds that in all the other 4 lakes together. He said, yes, I've no rebuttal. And it didn't change his position one iota.
He has his mind made up.
It's worse than that, honey. It's a closed mind.
I see.
Yeah. So, I've derived a lot of pleasure and out of this kind of a thing. There's still things of that kind that I'm interested in, but I've missed, I see you're running short of tape there, but I've missed one of the most interesting things about these smelters at Bartlesville. Before statehood, a man by the name of Foster was given a blanket lease to the mineral rights in Osage County. After statehood and after Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States, his Secretary of Interior, Philander C. Knox, looked at these papers and he decided that this was too much to give to any single individual. So he notified Mr. Foster, well, really it was the original Foster's son, then H.V. Foster, who was running the company, that they proposed to put this Osage lease up for sale again and invite many people to bid on it. This was very upsetting to Mr. Foster because he had already spent a great deal of money in development out there. He had a good customer here in 3 smelters at Bartlesville, and this was the livelihood of Bartlesville. No doubt about that at that time. It was really the support of Bartlesville, which was only less than 10,000 at that time, I guess. So he fought this with tooth and nail, and the smelters helped him. Out of which came an agreement, a new agreement, in which he had to give up the oil, but he still retained first call on most of the gas in the Osage Nation. And as a part of the deal, some 300,000 acres adjacent to Washington County line became known and was on the map as the smelter gas zone, and gas produced within this area, the smelters had first call on it, only subject to municipalities and uses of that kind. So this made a good supply of gas. A point I'd like to mention that I've often heard sneered at is that this was under strict federal control, and when a gas well was brought in, it was gauged, its open flow rate of gas was gauged, and then the operator was ordered to use not more than 20% of that open flow. Now, many people, for example, I used to hear first boss I had down here talk about seeing a 5-block smelter, that's a pretty fair-sized operation, operate on a single gas well for a year, and it only cost $1,000 to drill that gas well. And I think this is true. But the thing that was not emphasized was at the end of the year, the gas well was exhausted. All the gas was gone. Now, as a result of this 20% restriction, we're operating, National Zinc Company is operating wells out there right now that are nearly 50 years old. They don't produce much gas, but they, over the years, by slowing it down, giving the gas a chance to percolate through the rocks and get to that wellbore, it's produced a tremendous amount of gas. And they're still developing gas out there now. Right now, I can give you a big story about the negotiations there, but in 1966, the year I retired, the company bought the rights to that gas. It had originally been owned by the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company and Mr. Foster, And then he sold it out to the Empire Gas and Electric Company, which later on became the City Service Company. And that's, the smelters then began to have trouble to get the gas. They never had a bit of trouble with Mr. Foster. But the City Service decided they ought to have more money for it, and after carrying it all the way to the Supreme Court by their attorney, Bernard Blue, Tulsa, told them, when the smelter's attorney called up, said, I guess you've seen the latest from the Supreme Court on the gas question. Then he sat back in his swivel chair and laughed, and he said, yes, it's really amusing, isn't it? He says, you win one lawsuit right after another, but you don't get any gas. It was then they decided to compromise, and they did raise the price, and it was after that that we began to expand this plant and develop it. So this was a great factor.
All right. Before we do run out, why don't you tell us what Bartlesville was like when you came, and what was here?
Well, it was not so much Bartlesville, honey. It was it's the way people live, way of life.
Why don't you start that sentence over?
Ma'am?
Start again.
Well, you asked what Bartlesville was like when we first came here. Well, we had a little house which still stands at 1201 Armstrong. This is over halfway toward the smelter as far as east and west is concerned. And there was a grocery store nearby, and they gave us some credit. Otherwise, we'd probably starve to death the first month. But, for example, if we wanted a little picnic, my wife would fix it up, and we'd put a couple of baskets on our arms and get the kids by the hands, and we'd walk down to Johnstone Park, which was a mile and a half, see. We'd eat our picnic lunch and then come back walking, take nothing of it. When the kids had their tonsils taken out, we brought them down to one of the main buildings over here, still stands, which had been the doctor's offices in it then. And Dr. Green, the eye, ear, nose, and throat man, removed their tonsils in his office, let them lie on a couch there for an hour, and then we did take them home in a taxi cab. And this was part of the deal. They got a big thrill out of riding in a taxi cab. I think this would set the tone of the way, how different things were. You didn't cover as much ground. You did it more by hand. You walked.
Was it kind of a company town with the smelters being the...
No, it was the company. The smelters were a strong factor in the economy of the town, but it was not dominated by the smelter at all. And it was, I'd say, rather typical of towns at that time, but very different from now.
How big?
Yes. It was maybe 10,000 people then, 30,000 now, 35.
Well, I think they're going. This has been an interview with Mr. Bern F. Buff in Bartlesville.